to do the work that you're doing, working in corrections, working in prisons? What prepared you?
Well, I had an excellent seminary education. I was at Drew University, the School of Theology. But before that, when I was in college, I got involved with the Quakers and the civil rights movement, and I began to see how effective the church could be, not only in parish ministry, but also in institutions. When I was in seminary, I was a clinical intern chaplain at Rikers Island and also at a mental hospital in New Jersey and the Methodist Hospital in Brooklyn. But it was at Rikers Island that I began to see the possibilities of a program that was modeled after what I had learned at the Ecumenical Institute in Chicago, which was a radical social action arm of the church, actually. And that's where I got the cadre concept, the Exodus cadre concept, an intentional group that was focused on a specific area of concern or problem, where we measured, identified the problems, built solutions to them, and then went looking for the resources to implement the solution. And I had become chaplain at Greenhaven at that point, and actually my work as a chaplain actually started at Rikers Island, and I did have to have at least 10 years parish experience to be a certified chaplain. So I worked also when I was in parish ministry at a county jail in Rockland County. So I had involvement with the city prisons, the county jails, and then in 1967 I went to Greenhaven as a chaplain.
Many of the people listening to you today, as we are in this audience, know who Reverend Muller, the chaplain, is. But tell us, share a little bit with us about who is Ed Muller, the man?
Well, that's a tough question. I would think that my ministry and work as a chaplain in a lot of ways defined who I am. I wanted to be on the cutting edge. What I'd learned in the 60s in the civil rights movement, I was able to implement and at Greenhaven. And I think, if I were to define myself, it would be to be committed to the things that are life-giving in any arena, and to work with people who want to be life givers. I remember that phrase, by the way, has caught on with the men over the years. I remember when Eddie Ellis was released, he called me up about 3 weeks later and he said, "Hey Rev, this is Eddie, just another life giver checking in." And I think, I would like to be thought of as a person who brings about life-giving change in a situation. And that's not an easy task when you work in prisons.
Over the years, I've heard many of the men who have been exposed to your ministry refer to themselves, and particularly events in their lives or moments, as life-giving. Those special moments. You've referenced the 60 years. We've referenced it. What one or two events really come to your mind as you think about the 60 years, particularly in the state system, not so much at Rikers, but within the state system?
Well, I think there are a number of things in my early experience at Greenhaven that are certainly memorable. I remember when we started the first college program, and the first man to leave Greenhaven and go on campus. And by the way, back then, we didn't know whether anyone in prison could do college work. Um, I think at the time there were only two prisoners in Greenhaven who had a college background. They both were medical doctors, and they were there for performing abortions when abortion was illegal. And so when we formed the first college class, both the employees at Greenhaven didn't think it would work, and most of the inmates didn't either. But that first class produced some amazing people, and when Jerry Hooks was the first guy out the door to attend college on campus, when he graduated with high honors 2 years later, that rippled through the inmate population. And then another member of that class a few years later ended up graduating from Yale Law School, was the first person to be admitted to the bar with a felony background. And another member of that first class became an MSW and eventually I think earned a doctorate in social work. So there was like an explosion of possibility. And that was at the heart of what our work was centered on, what we call imaginal education, which I learned a lot about at the Ecumenical Institute. When you set afoot a new human being in an arena like Greenhaven, it gets a lot of attention. And I think by the time the Attica uprising took place, we had a full college program going, which offered a 2-year degree. We had a multitude of other programs. We had pre-release and post-release. We had outside, we had housing for people when they were released. We had workshops in Harlem, Mount Vernon, and Poughkeepsie that provided temporary income and a half day of work. And all our staff, except for 2 people, were, we had, I think, 12 employees, and all of them were out of the Exodus cadre, except for 2 that we hired to run the college programs. Actually, Ken Moody was the first director of our college program, and he did an amazing job putting that program together. And so all these programs were fully operational. Actually, inside we had the long-term Exodus cadre. We had a short-term contact program that was run by Dave Spencer. And Dave had come, he had been a civil rights leader in Harlem and was very well known. And he came, he also had done a lot of time in prison. And he worked closely with us at Greenhaven in those early programs. And it was, we just launched this multitude of creative programs that came out of the Exodus cadre. And I might mention that in the beginning, we identified 1,200 problems that men in prison faced. And we reduced that way down and eventually created about 15 programs that dealt with those problems. And I don't know if I mentioned, one thing we ran the year after the Attica event took place was a summer camp. Every man in Greenhaven who wanted to could send his son to our summer camp. And at the end of the camp, I think it ran for 2 weeks, we brought all the children into the prison for a father-son picnic. And that made the front page of the New York Times and actually gave birth to family events that spread and took place, I think, in every prison eventually in the state.
There are a number of things you're credited with over the years that have helped significantly to improve the quality of life for the men in prison, their families, family reunion programs. You just mentioned the events at Faithfield, the summer camp, for families. All these things over the years have given life to a number of different programs. How have you been able to do this dance with the inmate and yet be so popular with the inmate and yet survive within a system that generally frowns with employees, because you were a corrections employee, frowns upon correctional employees fraternizing or really trying to give something back to the men in prison?
Well, one thing I discovered when I went to Greenhaven in 1967 was that the prison system, I felt, was at least 10 years behind what was going on outside. And outside had, the war on poverty was very popular and had spread all over the country. But no programs existed. For instance, there were no volunteers even in Greenhaven, except an occasional maybe outside preacher who would come and take part in a religious service. And right in the beginning, I introduced a lot of outside volunteers. For instance, the Ecumenical Center in Stony Point used to send, they trained lay missionaries, doctors, teachers, an airplane pilot was there. And they would send them for 16 weeks every week, and they would be part of our Exodus cadre. So every meeting was half outside people and half people, prisoners from Greenhaven. Then the State University of Oneonta for 35 years sent their, one class would come twice each semester. Dr. Paul Conway would bring them, and they would come on a Friday and then all day Saturday. We had students from Union Theological Seminary, Drew Seminary, Vanderbilt School of Theology, and they were all part of a variety of programs that we ran, both in the college program, the cadre, and several students worked for me like full time in the summer as chaplain interns, and they brought a rich presence into our programs.
Over the years, I mean, you speak of a rich presence. Over the years, you've brought some heavyweights. I mean, you've brought Bill Bradley in, Senator Bradley. You brought him in. You brought the author Claude Brown. You've brought Paul Simon. Paul Simon actually writes a play about one of the men in your program. Speak to that, if you would. The people you brought in and the impact that you had on their life.
Well, it was a constant flow of people. There were a large number of theologians. Pablo Richard from Chile, a liberation theologian in Central America. There was Richard Shaw, who had written over 40 books. He was a liberation theologian in Brazil, and he also was professor of ecumenical theology at Princeton. Dorothy Sola from Union Seminary. I mean, there were a whole. Actually, Bill Weber came in those early days, also. And then I think there probably were. I used to run clergy seminars. There probably were at least 200 clergy that came in for those seminars that we ran. Actually, Henry Nouwen, Father Nouwen, was at Yale at the time, and he would bring his class.
Now, he's the author of the book Wounded Healer.
The Wounded Healer, yeah.
Okay. You mentioned Bill Weber, and many of us in the audience today know whom Bill Weber was. Tell us a little bit about your working with Bill Weber and how that led to New York Theological Seminary's master's program in Sing Sing.
Well, I first met Bill Weber when I was in seminary. Bill Weber had founded the East Harlem Protestant Parish, and it became a model for urban ministry, and it was known all over the world. Actually, people would come to East Harlem to study what he was doing there, and when I was in seminary, we were sent over to observe his work. So that was the first time I met Bill. What what led me to oh, by the way, when we started our early program and we provided housing, we had 14 rooms at the New York Theological Seminary dormitory, and we housed our former prisoners right in with the seminary students, and we made that arrangement with Bill Weber when he was president of the seminary. But what probably in the mid 70s, I organized a contemporary theology seminar at the prison, and there were outside seminary students involved with it, and also the men in Greenhaven. And what I discovered was that the men in Greenhaven could do theology just as good, and sometimes even better than the seminary students, because the men in Greenhaven had more life experience. And that idea led to my wanting to have a seminary class in the prison. And what I originally wanted was a class where outside seminary students could take a class with the men at Greenhaven, and they both would get credit. But the department would not allow that. So that's when I went down to talk to Bill at the seminary. And what I had in mind was the certificate in ministry program. I didn't even know the Master of Professional Studies degree existed. But when I met with Bill, he said, let's do a master's degree, not just the certificate program. And I think that was a huge step in the right direction. And that program was supposed to originally be at Greenhaven, but the seminary faculty didn't want to travel that far, so we put the program at Sing Sing, which probably was a much better move because of Sing Sing's fame. And but it's interesting. Bill used to one time referred to me as his mentor. I said, mentor? I said, when I was a student in seminary, Bill, you were a legend. And,
well, Ed, I think it's fair to say that at this stage, you're the legend here. And where do you see, Exodus, the cadre, some of the things, the avenues of hope that you're doing with long-termers and lifers, all of these programs, where would you like to see the legacy of what you've initiated, what you've started, what you've built, and what has become your life work?
Well, I've been pondering that this past year, and I'm not sure I have any answers yet. I mean, one thought I had was, now that this is our 50th year, maybe declare this as a period of time that has come to an end, and we now face a new beginning, a second phase. I firmly believe the reason we're still so effective, first of all, it's the concept of the program built on imaginal education. But I think we're still coasting from those early programs. We launched the first college program. We're involved with the development of the seminary program. We have always dealt from the very beginning primarily with lifers and long-term people who almost by nature become the leaders. And the other thing is we've unearthed a creative edge that was there, that was, we kind of created avenues and opportunities where that could come to fruition, where people could find their potential and move in a whole new direction. I've been asking the men in the Exodus program what it was that has worked for them, and we're still trying to find those answers. I think we know what we've done has worked. It has been effective. I'm not sure we know why.
I've heard or I've seen many of the men who have come through being exposed to you. I don't want to use the word your programs, but they've been exposed to you, the man. And along the way, the opening rites, the closing rites are still. You can go so many places, and people will say the past is approved, the present is received, the future is open, and that's embraced. That becomes embodied in people's lives. And the question around a biblical foundation for your work for Exodus, would it be fair to say that that comes out of the Exodus journey, the bondage, the wilderness, and the promised land?
Well, there are a number of scripture references that have been foundational for me, and I think for the Exodus program. Yeah, the Egypt wilderness and promised land, we've used that for many, many years now. Egypt is the experience of oppression, of bondage. The wilderness is the experience of wandering, and Egypt is the prison experience. And when you're in a state of oppression, you lose your freedom, you become powerless, you become dependent on whatever Pharaoh decides. He provides your food, your housing, he provides the meaning of your life, whether you like it or not. And for a lot of men in prison, the wilderness is the street. And a certain distortion sets in. They look at the street as the promised land. If I can just get out of here, freedom is the final answer. But when they get out in the wilderness, they're no longer victims of oppression. They are wanderers. It's like Israel wandered 40 years in the wilderness, not because she didn't have a map. It was because she didn't know what she was about anymore. She didn't have a central purpose. Moses left Egypt actually as a cop killer. He was on the run. He was sent back to Egypt after a mountain experience as a liberator of his people, a wholly different posture and self-understanding. For us in Exodus, the Promised Land are, our contract where we set goals. If your life-giving goals are powerful enough, they will pull you out of bondage. They will pull you through the wilderness and give you a new meaning of life. And so that biblical reference is one thing. Another one is, in the book of Isaiah, it says there's a highway in the desert, which is called the Holy Way. Many theologians believe that's a reference to the King's Highway that ran from Egypt to Jerusalem, or a highway that leads from death to life. And it's important for people in prison to believe that that highway is there, that there is a road that leads from death to life. For me, that's been an important biblical reference. Also, Ezekiel, can these bones live?
Dry bones.
Dry bones, yeah. I think the parable of the prodigal son is a good biblical story to study. Here's a young Jewish boy who takes his inheritance and squanders it. He ends up broke and in a pigsty. Now, for a young Jewish boy to end up in a pigsty fighting with the pigs for food. That's about hitting bottom as low as you can get. And what do you do when you hit bottom? You know, can you pick up your life and move in a new direction, and in a life-giving direction?
I've had the luxury of knowing many men who have been in that pig pit, build their life up, and went to new horizons. And I think to a man, they would attribute a lot of that to your work, to what you've done, how you've intervened and crossed in their lives. I'm not going to ask you to name any man, but I would ask you, as you look back over the years, what you referenced some being lawyers and some being doctors. What's the miracle for you? What's worked for you? You know, what's helped you continue in this work based upon what you've seen?
Well, I think it's the amazing results we've had. Almost every program that we started has worked and worked in a very successful way. You know, the early college program, the seminary program, the cadre program. I mean, everything has probably worked better than we even anticipated when we conceived the ideas. You know, I never forget when the way we got connected with William Vanderbilt and Helen Vanderbilt and Bill Bradley. One of our early men who happened to be one of my clerks was Napoleon Harris. And when he was released, he went to work in a street academy in Harlem. And he told Bill Vanderbilt what we were doing, and Bill Bradley, at Greenhaven and the model that we had developed. So they came to Greenhaven and looked at our model, this array of programs that we had put together. And I can still remember Bill Vanderbilt's word. He looked at it and said, "Let's do it." And you know, usually you create an idea and you say, "Boy, if only we could get some money, if only we could," you know, you sit around complaining. And that was a shocking experience to have somebody say, "Let's do it," you know. And he said, "You know, I want, you know, you people run it, and I'll raise the money." And he did, and we did. Dave Spencer and I, years later, we reflected back on everything we had created and done, and we decided we would not have done it any different if we could, because it seemed to work. And
As you look back on it, any missteps, any mistakes?
there probably are some, but I can't think of any.
Okay.
Right offhand.
Okay. Earlier on, I asked you about corrections itself. You know, you spent 4 or 5 decades as an employee of New York State Department of Corrections. I'm told that once was a conversation prior to Attica, that someone said we should take Reverend Muller as a hostage, and someone else in the group said, "You better not take him as a hostage. You better hope he's on the negotiating team." How were you able to achieve that type of success with the population, as well as, again, I'll go back to the earlier question, make that dance with corrections? I do know enough about your ministry to know that correction officers and corrections administrators didn't give you a red carpet. You know, many of them, although they would be grateful for the work that you were doing and the peace that you kept in the facility and things like that, but, you know, they weren't necessarily your best friends either. How did you do that dance?
Well, I probably did it accidentally. You know, years later I learned that I had really connected with a lot of power and didn't realize it. William Vanderbilt had been governor of Rhode Island and knew Governor Rockefeller personally. And so we had that connection. Also, J. Edward Meyer was on our board. He was a key assemblyman. Actually, he and George Pataki shared an office when they both were in the assembly. And, of course, Bill Bradley was just by his name was indicated, a connectedness. And, we had all these programs that worked, and we had, solid connections to people outside. And also there were people, as the years rolled by and different people became commissioners and in the higher echelon, a lot of them had admired, the work we were doing at Greenhaven, and they admired it quietly, but when they got in places of power, they continued to support us. And also, that's a hard thing, as I think back over the years. With the inmate population, in the early years, I fought against a lot of the brutality. I testified in court cases, and I know I always let it be known to the inmate population that I would never volunteer to testify, but if I'm subpoenaed, I would answer every question honestly. So that got me involved in some pretty big court cases, which worked out okay. And I can remember, as a result of fighting the brutality, in my Sunday service, usually in the front row were the leaders of the Muslim community, and they came because they wanted to show their support. So I don't, it was a delicate situation that I navigated without knowing what I was really navigating, but I seemed to make the right moves at the right time.
Okay.
So
We've got a few more minutes, and again, we're here today celebrating your presence. That I'm aware of, you've received a number of awards. You've been given the National Chaplain of the Year Award with ACA and other organizations. You've done some great work, and I would be amiss to say that if I personally didn't benefit from the work that you've done. But as we begin to close this time together, what would you say to someone who was coming in today, starting a bid? What would you say to them if you had the opportunity?
Well, the main thing, and I think every individual might take different paths, but find your potential, and look for the avenues of hope. I think it was Soren Kierkegaard and also William Sloane Coffin picked up on it because he wrote a book. Hope is the passion for the possible. And I think if people can find their potential, come to terms with their past, whatever crimes they've committed, people they've disappointed, I think they have to explore the power of forgiveness, not only seeking forgiveness, but being willing to forgive, that releases them from carrying a heavy burden. And explore, also look for the pace setters, the people who have come to prison and grown tremendously while they're in prison, both spiritually and educationally and a lot of other ways. Most people have a lot more potential than they ever realized they had, and I think that's important in trying to come to terms with the whole prison experience.
Stop right there. What you're about to do, because if I could stop it, I could still have it recorded.
Okay, what I wanna
and then
do-
we can cut in whatever you're about to do.
All right, so here's what, we have
Go ahead.
5 minutes left.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to make sure if there was any other questions, or if there's any,
Go ahead.
Eric.
Because you would ask the question about what would he say to somebody beginning to be a bid. I thought you were going to say someone entering ministry as a prison chaplain.
Yeah, that's what
Okay,
I
I
thought.
can do that, I can go there, okay.
Okay, so let me get out. Go ahead.
So I asked you, what would you say to someone who was starting a bid? Taking that same context, what would you say to someone who was going to start out today as a prison chaplain? What would your advice be to them?
Well, I think the number one thing would be to make sure that you always work on an interfaith basis. In other words, a ministry of inclusiveness. Whatever programs you run, make sure they're open. Don't form a narrow faith-based concept that reflects only your own background. I happen to be United Methodist, but if I were Pentecostal or born again fundamentalist, if you stick in those worlds, you lose about 2/3 of the inmate population. All my programs have always been inclusive. And New York Theological Seminary has been inclusive, which I think has been one of the rich characteristics of that program. I remember one guy who came back from that program said, there were Protestants, Catholics, Jews, Muslims, Rastafarians, and he said even one atheist in his class, and they all grew together and in a sense of richness of the experience. The other thing is, I made a whole list of things what makes a good chaplain. One thing I mention is always do one thing more than you have to. If I had to call a man down to tell him his mother died, I would always say, who else? I'd give him a phone call to a family member, and then I would always ask, who else would you like to talk to? And I would place a second call. I remember one time on a Friday night, they asked me to let an inmate know that his mother had died, and the following Friday, when I was at Greenhaven, I walked up on the third tier all the way down to the last cell to visit him and ask him how the funeral went. And he followed me all the way back down the gallery and said, nobody's ever shown any real care. And he said, I appreciate your coming to see how that funeral visit went. The second mile principle, I think, doing more than you have to, doing something that moves you into the realm of a generous sense of caring.
Speaking of going the second mile, is it true that you let an inmate call his family in China?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, yeah, that was quite an episode.
There's a whole lot of second miles. Right?
Yeah. Oh, I could tell you a lot of second miles.
Okay. Then, as we conclude, just a closing thought. What closing thought would you like to share with us today?
Well, I think probably, there's an old gospel song that has a line in it: the tears of the sower and the joy of the reaper shall meet in the sweet by and by. I've been fortunate to be a sower and a reaper. I've seen the results of a lot of the work that I've done, and I think there's a lot we need to be thankful for. That's been the outcome and the result of our Exodus program in particular, but of a lot of other programs. You know, the richness. We've created a richness that has come out of the prisons, and that's something I think to be very thankful for.
And again, I'm thankful for your ministry, and I hope that you have many more years to continue your ministry in the work that you're doing. Thank you.
For me, Exodus boils down to a search for one's potential. Whatever one's problem is, whatever one's come to prisons for, whatever his state was in the street. Sometimes we're in the street and we're very rich people, and we come to jail for flukes of all kinds, you know. But once you're in prison, it all boils down to how do I deal with a situation that I wasn't really, you know, prepared for. And that comes down to potential, and that's why everyone I know who went to Exodus, that's what their search was for. What can I find here that would help me deal with my life situation? You know, and that's for me what Exodus is all about. Finding one's potential. Finding one's potential means that I have to grit. Where do I go to find the answers to things that I can do? You know, most of us in prison have been denied, you know, all the things that make a person feel that he can come off or he can be the best in whatever he wants to achieve. Those things are not probably possible for most of the people who come to prison. Most of us find that in prison. I found that in prison. My potential, I found in prison. I found it right there at Exodus. I found the books. I found out where I can search. I found all that out. And now the rest was for me was to follow through with it. So that's for me. That's what the whole aim of the glory of Exodus is that those who are achieved in it, and I don't know anyone who's failed, you know, they found their potential.
My name is John Ducksworth. When I think of Exodus, I think of it this way. I spent maybe 4 or 5 years with Exodus as part of my life during incarceration. However, after I was paroled, I've spent over 30 years living Exodus and embracing it, looking, whenever I've reached benchmarks in my life, personally, I've gone back to the contract. Whenever I've come up against obstacles in my life, there was a period in my life where I didn't think about dealing with those obstacles without reaching out to Ed Muller. Whenever I came over those times in my life, those periods in my life where I needed to do some deep theological reflection, I always went back to the book of Exodus and reread the journey, the bondage, the wilderness, and the promised land. So for me, Exodus is not just walking in the prison yard. Exodus is living over 30 years of life, paroled, outside, beyond corrections, and enjoying the things that I have done since my release. I continue to say to this day, my past is approved, my present is received, and my future is open.